Hi everyone, in this video we are going to implement Spring AOP and we'll be looking at the concern that we already have in our application, that is logging. So before we start, let's take a look at the Maven dependencies that we have for AOP. So when you add Spring Boot Starter Web, it also includes Spring Boot Starter AOP. So if you scroll down and if you look at your Maven dependencies, you will find Spring Boot Starter AOP. So what this does is it also pulls all the dependencies related to AOP, that is aspect JWeaver, then we have Spring aspects, okay, and also Spring AOP. So if you scroll up, you can see that we also have Spring AOP. There are two APIs that you need to remember, that is JDK dynamic proxies, and these are the APIs which are within the JDK, which are used to create proxy objects. Okay, and these are the default API. This is the default API or technique used by Spring AOP to create proxy objects. Okay, the condition is that the target object must implement an interface. Okay. And the other technique used is cglib, that is the CG library, which is included within the Spring Core API. So if you expand the Spring Core, you can see that it has cglib, right? So here the condition is that the target object is extending a class. Okay, so with this information, and also the different APIs that are related to AOP in our Maven dependencies, let's start implementing the AOP for our cross-cutting concern, that is logging. First, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a package called AOP, and then I'm going to create an aspect here, aspect class, and I'm going to call this as logging aspect, and this I'm going to annotate with aspect. Okay, and I want this to be managed by Spring Container, so I'm going to annotate this with one of the stereotypes annotation, and the best suited one is configuration, because we are doing all the configuration related to the aspect, that is cross-cutting concern. Configuration. Okay, so with this, let's create a logger variable. Logger manager. Log manager is, and get loggers. Okay, so we have now the logger variable. Now you'll be using this to add some logging statement in our aspect. So now as we know that we can have behaviors in our aspect, and these behaviors are basically used to add actions, right? And these actions are nothing but called as advices, right? So there are many advices that we have in in AOP. So what we're going to do is, first we're going to use around advice, because this is the most used and most powerful one, as it executes before and after a join point. Okay, so let's create a around advice, and for that I'm going to have a method that has a return value of object, and I'm going to say this as log around, and the parameter I'm going to have here is the join point, that is proceeding join point. And the object here is basically the return value of the target behavior. Okay, so how we are going to use the join point is, and as per the definition, join point is the a point where the aspect behavior, that is this, and the target behavior joins. Okay, this is what join point is. Join point dot proceed, and proceed is nothing but it proceeds to the next chain in the execution, that is nothing but our execution of the target behavior. And I'll save this as an object and I'll call it as a return value, and finally I'm going to return this return value. And this method return throws an exception of type throwable, so I'm going to declare it as throws. And you can see that this is the value that is being returned from the target object, and you can perform any modification on this return value, and this will be returned to our client. So this is the final point of where the response is being returned to the client. So you can see that you can make any update to the return value. Again, you can add any parameter, or you can also, what you can do is, as it is before the execution of join point, you can also have some logic here and then execute it. That is the execution, that is the proceed to the target method execution, and the return value can then be modified and then returned to as a response. Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to first try to log some information, that is the incoming request. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say logger.debug, and I don't need all of this, and I'm going to say this as request for, and this is going to be my class name, this is going to be my method name, and with arguments, and the arguments can be a single or multiple arguments, and again I have the cloud brackets here. Okay, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass all these values. Join point dot get, first is the signature dot get declaring type name, this is going to be your class name. Okay, and then I'm going to have the method name. I'll just in the next line, join point dot get signature dot get name. So this is my method name. Now I'm going to have the arguments. So I'm going to have join point dot get arguments, and this is an array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this as arrays dot to string. Okay, so now I have, it has a debug. So any incoming request for a particular method of a class will be logged along with its arguments. Perfect. And I'm using debug. And I will also, what I'll do is I'll also log the total execution time. Okay, the execution time for the target method. Okay, so for that, what we're going to do is we're going to use instant API from Java time. I would say start dot now. Okay, and then here after the execution, I'm again going to say this as finish dot now, and then I'm going to take the duration between the start and the finish to milliseconds. I'm going to convert this as millisecond, and this is nothing but of type long, and I would say this as time elapsed. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm again going to log this, and this is after the execution of the join point, right? After the execution of join point, I have the duration, okay, the time it took to execute the target method. Then I'm going to log it, debug, and this is where I'm going to put this as response for my class name, method name. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is I'm also going to say with result is equal to this, and then I'm going to use the same thing here, and but this time what I'm going to do is the final parameter is going to be my return value. Okay, so and I'll also add my info message, and this is going to be the time taken. Okay, and I'm going to put this as in a proper format, and for that what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a simple date formatter, and I'm going to do this as new simple date formatter, and the pattern that I'm going to use is as minute, second, and milliseconds. Okay, and I'm going to pass a yes, I missed one parameter here or bracket here, and I'm going to say format new date, and I'm going to pass the time elapsed, that is the one we have here. Okay, so this is going to print the time taken to execute the target behavior. So what I'm doing, I'm using the info. This is fine, right? This is going to be information, whether it may be development environment or production environment. We want this information to be printed, that is the total time taken to execute the target behavior. Okay, and this is something, you know, that is a debug only used in our development environment, because you know the return result can be huge. It can be a collection, and we don't want that to be printed in our production environment, because you know the return value can also can have some sensitive information, and we don't want to print that in our logs. Okay, but for development environment where debug is enabled, it is okay, fine. And if you know, if the return type is a collection type, then you know you don't want to print that in your log here. So what you can do is again try to have some logic where you just print few numbers of, you know, the data in the collection, and it is okay to print the size of the collection, rather than, you know, if there are like thousands of records, you don't want to put that in your debug or the you know, or in the file, right, the log files. Fine, with this I guess we are good. Now what we're going to do is we are going to run this application and see if this thing gets printed in our application. Okay, that is our console. Let me bring up the Postman. Okay, so first let's start the application, and okay, so application is up. Let's go back to our Postman, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the get method here. So let's go back to our IDE and see what we have in our console, and you can see that there is nothing printed. Why? Because we added the advice, but we did not add the point cut. Okay, so the reason why, you know, I wanted to not have the point cut here, so we know that, you know, the concept that we learned in our previous session, it comes all together in, you know, in action here. So we remember that what is point cut, what is join point, and what is advice. Okay, so let's add the point cut. So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to use first the around advice. Okay, that says this is around, that is the advice we are going to use. This needs to be executed before and after the join point execution, and accordingly we also had the join point as an argument, right? And Then we add here the expression, and this is the expression which is called as point cut. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use an expression where it says within, okay, and this should be in as a type of string, and I'm going to use this as within any class that is annotated with a stereotype. Okay, and the stereotype can be a service, it can be a controller or a repository. So what we're going to do is we're going to apply this logging aspect for controller, okay, rather than having it for, you can use any, okay, you can also use all the classes that you have for, you know, that are annotated with service annotation or repository annotation, and also controller. So but to keep it simple, what we're going to do is we're going to have a point cut expression where all the classes that are annotated with controller. Okay, so for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a REST controller. That is what we have at the, you know, if you look at our flight controller, you can see we have annotation REST controller. So this is what we're going to use here, and I'm going to put this here. Okay, so let's look at, is this the package name that we are using? And yes, right, I'm just going to use this one. So what it says is basically any annotation, okay, or any class that is annotated with REST controller needs to be executed. Okay, we'll also use another point cut here, and what we're going to do is we're going to use another by using logical condition, that is, and we'll say within again, and this time we are going to have the name of the package. Okay, and this time I'm going to say it as, I'm going to use our package, that is this, right? What it says is all the classes within the airline web services and sub packages. Okay, so we have two conditions here. The expression, this is a predicate, okay, that says it is all the classes that are annotated with REST controller, and now we are having more restricted or restriction to our classes that it needs to match, that is within this package and sub packages. So that means any classes within our custom packages that are annotated with REST controller will be matched, and this around advice will be executed. Okay, so let's save this, and now let's let this get restarted. And what it says, okay, so here we have something, it says, okay, so we have an issue here, that is within, okay, I have a space which I should not. Now let's see. Okay, did it restart? Let's see. Restart here. Okay, so it's again an exception. It says within, which is actually, oh, okay, so here I'm missing, one thing, that is star. Okay, that says any class that is annotated with this expression. Let's restart this again. So we missed this. There is a pattern, okay, that we need to follow when we are using within, or there is also another method, that is execution, right? Okay, so it looks like this time it worked, because now we have updated our within predicate here that says all the classes that are annotated with REST controller. Okay, similar to what we have with our packages. Now let's clean this up and go back to our Postman, and let's try to and the get method. Now this time if we go back here, and you can see that the logging aspect was printed, and we have debug and info, and the debug says response for the class name followed by the method name with result flight DTO, and you can see this is the request or the result that we got. And we also should have the request. You can see here the request, and the argument is 8. This is what we are passing as an argument, right? And the time taken, finally, this is the info, right? So with that, what we can do is we can get rid of the logging statement that we have in our controller class that is here. So let's get rid of this. Perfect. So now let's go back to our logging aspect and try to add few more information here. What we're going to do is we can also, modularize this. Again, means we can separate out the predicate, that is expression, from here. So if you have multiple advices, what you can do is you can create a method and then add that method here. Okay, let's try to do that. Okay, let's take an example here, and what we're going to do is public, I'll say this void, and I would say this as application package, and I would say controller package, basically, because that is what I am using, package. And I'll then annotate this with point cut, and the expression that I'm going to give here is this. Okay, and I can also refine this as, again, say this as controller, because I'm using specifically for controller this point cut. I can use this, and same way, and here what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace this with the application controller package. Okay, and the same way I can have another point cut, and this I can call it as application controller bean rather than the package, and I'll put this here. And this time I'm going to use this here. Okay, let's save this and try to rerun and see if we get the same behavior. So this is a good practice, actually. We're putting separating out the point cuts. That way we can reuse this point cuts if we have multiple advices in our aspect. Let's go back to our Postman and try to submit again. If you go back here, and you can see that till we get the same response, right? Perfect. So now what we're going to do is we are going to see our exception handling, and here we have different methods, and in case of an exception we also need to log this, right? We don't want to just send back the response, but we also want to log it, so when the client reports an issue with that error reference, what we can do is we can search our log and try to troubleshoot the issue. So let's implement an advice. So let's go back to our aspect here, and this time we are going to use the advice called public void. The return type is void, and we have this log after throwing, right? And the advice name is after throwing. And the point cut that I'm going to use is, we will look at the point cut, but first let's implement this join point, and I'm going to use this join point and throwable, and this is E. I'll just name it as E. Then next what I'm going to do is I'm going to log it. Okay, and the messages that I'm going to print here is something like exception in the class name, the method name with cause. Okay, and this is the cause. And then what I'm going to do is with message. Okay, so let's try to add all this information here. First is the join point dot get signature dot get, and it's going to be my declaring method, declaring type name. Then I'm going to use it as giving me an error. The signature is undefined. Okay, let's try to add all other and see. Join point dot get signature dot get name. Then I have is got it here. I should have added comma. And next, then I'm going to add the cause. So the cause comes from the throwable, and here it is. Then I have first I have to check whether it, if it is null or not. So what I'm going to do is, if it is null, if it is present, I would say if it is not null, then I'm going to get the cause. Else I'm going to print this as null. Okay, and the same way I'm going to get the message, and again if it is not null, then you don't get message, or else I'm going to print it also as null. Perfect. So with this we have the error logged to our console, and again this is error because we did not add the required attributes. So let's add the point cut expression. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a method again here, and I'll name this as public void, and this is going to be my what I will name this as, let's call here. Okay, instead of that I should have copied this because it's going to be my package. Let's do that, and this is going to be the exception here, exception, and I'm going to say application exception package. Okay, this is what I'm going to use here, and I'm going to name this as point cut. Okay, that is my point cut, and this is what I'll be having. Okay, so with this, let's save this, and it's again, it says error at 0. That is exactly this error. See, okay, yeah, the error is you have the join point, but you also need to declare your throwable. So that is going to be, I need to say that throwing E, because that is what. Okay, I'll just name it as I've used. Okay, perfect. So this name needs to be matched with what we have declared here. Okay, so now you can see that there is no error in the console. So now let's try to go and submit the request here. For success, there is no exception going to be, there is no exception, so everything works fine. But let's try to throw some exception. Okay, this is going to throw some validation exception, right? So let's see that how it's going to print in our console. And let's go back. You can see that there is an error response. That means the method from our exception handler, that is API exception handler, was executed. But you can see here there is also an exception handled here where it says, okay, it looks like it was not yeah, so it was not handled here. This wasn't called. Okay, so let's see why. Looks like is exception call airline service exception. That is this, right? And we have everything within it. Looks good. And what is the error? Yes, it should be. I guess that is why it wasn't printed. Let's see. Okay, I think this was the issue. Let's try to resend this time and see. And yes, again, it is not printed. Why? Let's see. Okay, the problem why it isn't logging is because we are giving an expression here with a predicate that says it should match exception. That means any exception that is thrown within this package, and the validation exception is thrown from our controller, right? Not from this package. So what we're going to do is we're going to change this to something, from our, we'll make it this as global for any exception that is thrown in our custom package. Okay, that is airline web services as the base package, and any other sub packages we are going to log it. Okay, so this is how we can do by using dot and all the classes within it. That is this package, there is a base package as well as sub packages. Okay, so now let's save this and see. Okay, I'll clear it, and if I click on send, and if I look at the IDE, and you can see that now we see the exception in the class and the flight name, and the cause is null. Okay, because there is no cause that we have for the constraint error. Then we have the message that says must be greater than 0. So this is what is being logged in our application with error level. Okay, and you can have other information also added in your log. Okay, if you think that if in the debug mode, okay, you want to add some debug information, you can add here. Okay, like trace and all those information. Okay, so here we have within expression used. We can also have something that is more restricted to a particular class or method level expression. If you want to add, you can use something called execution, like something like this. It will look, and it would say execution, and that is a particular format that you can use. Okay, that has modifier, then followed by the package name, then the class name, and then the method. Any method you can say this way. Okay, let's try to add this for, assume that we are adding this for controller, that is our flight controller, and this needs to be, okay, that is a specifier or any return type, then the name of the package, then I would say controller, and the flight controller, and I can also give the method name. If you think that it should be executed for all the methods, then you can just say dot. Okay, so this way what we do is we add an execution expression, that is execution point cut for a particular class and the methods within it. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to keep it simple. We're going to use this, okay, that is within. But just to remember that we also have a very in-depth level that we can use using execution. Okay, so with this, now we have after throwing, that is exception handling, when an exception occurs, we also are logging the details. Now we also have the debug information also information that we are logging. So we no more need any of the statements in our exception handler like this. Okay, we don't need an SOP and all those here. I'll just get rid of all this information, because what we're doing is when an exception occurs in an application, we wrap that up into a user-friendly object and send back to the user. At the same time, we are also logging it in our file. Okay, so here one thing that we need to also add is what happens when there is an exception thrown and you want to try to trace out or try to troubleshoot the issue. How would you recognize that a particular request was made by the user and that request is having issue? So when you try to search your log file, you will have many logs, right? And how can you recognize the request which client is having issue, or the client has reported the issue? So for that, what we can do is, there is a technique that we can apply, okay, to recognize the request in your log with a particular information that you are trying to look at, or if you're trying to troubleshoot an issue, you know that exactly, okay, this is the request that was made by the user and this is the issue that you are trying to fix by looking at the log. So for that, what we're going to do is we are going to add a filter. So for that, first let's stop the server. So I'll create a package here, and what I'm going to do this is let's see if I can add, okay, I'll take the AOP itself, because all the logging related configuration we are having in AOP package, right? So let's create a filter here itself, and I'll create this as logging interceptor. As in Spring we call filter as interceptor. I'll name that as interceptor, and what this does is it implements handler interceptor. Okay, and then I have two methods here. One is pre-handle and the other one is post-handle. Okay, so the pre-handle will be executed before the target object, and the post-handle is executed after the execution of the target object. Okay, or more specifically the target method. Okay, so let's add some information here. So what we're going to do is, what we're trying to achieve here is we're going to add an identifier to every request made by the client. So that helps us, when that request is logged, okay, or if there is something that we are logging with the particular request, it also has the identifier. Okay, and this identifier will be using to send back to the client, and when the client reports an issue, then using that as a reference, we can try to search in our log file. Okay, so to do that, we have an API in Log4j that is thread context. Okay, it is similar to what we have MDC, that is mapped diagnostic context in SLF, SLF4j. In Log4j we have, we can achieve that with using thread context. Okay, thread context, and I'll say this as context, and this has static methods in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a string. You can see it takes key value pair, and here I'm going to add a request ID. Okay, and this I will pass something called, I'll use the UUID universal identifier dot, and I'll say the random ID to string. Okay, and this way you can also you can create any identifier using any API out there, you can create a unique ID that makes more easy to to save it here as a request ID, and then later can be used in your application for that particular request lifecycle. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use even something called the user ID. Okay, currently we don't have, but this is something that might be coming in the request, right, in the request header or as a parameter in the request itself, a request parameter. So you can also put that here and later use this user ID when you're trying to do some logging. Okay, but for now you can also use IP address, the host name or whatever. You can put any information here, as this interceptor is going to be the entry point for all the requests. Okay, and what it does is it first puts this information in the thread context, and later this information will be used in our all the logging statements. How? We'll see. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it a bit more simple. So I'll use the request ID. And next I'm going to do is I'm going to return this as true. Okay. And here in the post, okay, I have to remove that whatever I have added. Dot clear all. Simple. Okay. Now once we create the interceptor, we need to register it. How do we register? By creating a web config. So let's create a web config class here. Okay, and this will implement my web config adapter web MVC configure when configurer. And here what I'm going to do is I'm going to override the add interceptor, and here I'm going to add my interceptor, that is registry dot add interceptor new, the one that we created, logging interceptor. Perfect. Okay, that's it. Now your logging interceptor is registered. So this will be executed with your filter chain that we have in our Spring framework. Okay, so with this, let's go back to our aspect here, and we don't need to do anything in our aspect because all the logging statement by default will pick this up. All that we need to do is to go to our log4j file here and add it to our pattern. Okay, so how do we add here? So for that, what we're going to do is we are going to use a pattern, and we are going to say this as style. Let's put this as style. We'll style it with and for that we have to print whatever we have in thread context. To print that, we have something called x %x, and what this will do is it will print all the properties that you have put into the thread context. Okay, but if you are looking for a particular key, then all you need to do is use that here, request ID. So if you see in our interceptor, what we did, we added the request ID. So that is what we are having here, request ID. So if you don't give this request ID here, what it is going to do is it's going to print all the keys that you have in your thread context. Okay, but we are looking for the particular one, so we are using request ID. Okay, so let's save this. And also what I'm going to do is I'm going to style this with something called bright. I'll say this as red. Okay, let's save this, restart our application. Okay, so it is saying that, okay, so something is not right here. Let's see. I think it is because of the space here. So let's remove that and save this back again. Okay, so now you see it is correctly printed. Now let's go back to our Postman and try to submit the request and see. For the request, now we need to have a unique request ID also attached to the pattern, that is the log statement. Okay, so we have the date, the level, the log level, then thread name, followed by the request ID that we will be submitting, then followed by the class name and the message. Okay, let's do that. Let's click on submit, and I'm going to send some valid data here, and we got the response. Let's go back to here, and it is still not printing it. So what is wrong here? Let's see. Okay, looks like something is missing here. Let's look at web config. Okay, so here we did not create this as a bean. Okay, let's do that, and let's add this as configuration. Okay, now let's save this. Okay, so now let's clear the console and try to resubmit. Go back here, and now you can see that we have the request ID for our request, right? And it gives the class name, that is logging aspect, and the request, and then the response and the time taken. So now if there was an issue, now let's try to submit another one, and let's go back to our here, and if I give a negative or bad data, let's see what happens. And go to IDE, and this time you can see that the request ID is different compared to the other previous one, and here we have an exception. So this is the information that we are going to send back to the client, right? And the client will send us an issue reporting to the application team saying that, okay, this is the reference ID, and when you go and search in your log file, you'll use this as a reference ID and try to look at the message or the information related to the issue and try to troubleshoot it. So this way it saves our time actually, to look at something in our log file and trying to connect the request with something that we have in our log file. So I hope that is clear. With this, let's see what we can also add in our application apart from this. Okay, what we can do is in our exception handling class here, we are sending back this information, right? That is the time. So let's send the ID here, the request ID. So that way we can, connect the request, the client sending us some information, and depending on that request reference, that is error reference, we get, we can look into the log file. For that, what we do is here, we will be using thread context dot, and here I'm going to say it as get key, and this get key is going to be the request ID, and you can see what it returns is string, right? And just take this and put it over here instead of the local time. Okay, and the same thing I can do with all other information here, like this, and also here. We have more. Yes, we do have for the global exception. Perfect. Now if I save this, now let's try to see how when we submit a request, and if there is an exception, what does the client send back to the application team, and how can application team look into the log file and search for that issue. Okay, so let me clear this console here and go back to the Postman. Now if you see, this is a bad data that the client is sending. If I click on send, and if I go back, you can see here the error ID that we are sending to the client is this, right? So this is what the client is going to send back to the application team or the operations team. Now with this reference, what we are going to do is we are going to look at our log file, right? And you can see that the ID, the error ID here is also in our console, right? In our production environment is going to be a log file. So this is what is going to be printed in there, that is in the log file, and you can search that and connect that. Okay, this is the request and here is the exception that came in, and you can see that the request had all these arguments, that is the information and the exception information, and then you can try to troubleshoot and then fix the issue or respond back to the client. Okay, so that way, you know, this thread context and the request ID you can use to, you know, faster debugging or troubleshooting the actual issue. So I hope it's clear, you know, how we can use AOP and implement this for one of the cross-cutting concerns that we already had, that is logging.